Movement has been something, and motor issues has been something that our team has discussed for many years alongside other clinicians. We really at this stage don't know how central it is to our understanding of autism. What we do know is that things have moved forth in the world of autism in terms of sensory understanding. When a few years back we understood that sensory issues obviously are part and parcel of ASD, but didn't really understand how important it was. And we've now moved to a stage where the DSM-5 has it as part of its diagnostic criteria. So it's moved it from the periphery right into a central point. And I wonder where we will be in 10 years' time in terms of thinking about motor disorders or movement in ASD. And therefore, I suppose I'm posing some questions today. I'm not answering questions, but I'm posing some questions that has provoked some thought in our team. Now, Jonathan had opened up earlier saying that we weren't going to talk too much about stereotypical movements, which we're not, but I feel as though if we're talking about ASD in general, then we've got to pay some form of reference to the areas that we're very used to in autism. And of course, it's the clinical experience that we know that children hand flap, they tiptoe walk, they have whole body tensing, bouncing, rocking, spinning, finger flicking, facial grimacing and eye blinking. Now these are behaviours that we typically associate with ASD, and it's not rocket science, but it is something that we see on a daily basis. And again, this is something that we see on a daily basis, which is a disruption at some level in how young people motor plan, and obviously OTs look more closely at this, but as clinicians, again, it's part and parcel of our understanding of ASDs in general. And some children can't navigate stairs, so they go down one stair, 2 feet on, one stair, 2 feet on, can't ride a bike, can't tie their shoelaces, zips and buttons are very problematic. They won't use cutlery, so they tend to finger feed and use their hands to even eat spaghetti bolognese, but they just won't go near cutlery. Need assistance to dress and are quite clumsy and have awkward gaits. Now these are all things that obviously we recognise in everyday interactions with young people on the spectrum. There was a lot of talk earlier on about imitation, and we run a preschool intervention programme where imitation is a big part of our therapy, and it's a very productive part of our therapy. But you notice that there's disruptions in the way that young people can imitate, and thus you'll have a young person waving bye-bye with the back of their hand, or instead of pointing, there will be a whole hand point or perhaps a middle finger point. And of course, all the kind of muscles and the movement of facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and the synchronicity that happens perhaps even when you get into a waiting room and you walk in and you say, I'm looking for John Smith, and then you bounce into each other because you're just off time with each other. It doesn't work, and you have that in conversation as well. So we do recognise that these are very fundamental to our everyday experience and understanding of ASD. However, some people do go on to receive a diagnosis of DCD dyspraxia, but others who have subtle impairments maybe don't meet that clinical threshold but still have some subtle impairments, and that they'll continue to fall or spill their drinks, etc. But some of these young people who are academically very bright are very functionally impaired in later life, and you can see this whole mismatch, and we often get phone calls from parents saying he's doing really well at school, but actually he's just not able to look after himself. I need to still help him with the toileting, I need to help him dress, I need to help him organise himself in some way, and there's this whole mismatch. But these same young people perhaps have been very dexterous on Lego and have went on to become experts on the Xbox, and they'll be doing night shifts on the Xbox, and they can manipulate these technological aspects of their life very, very comfortably. So there's lots of anomalies that appear clinically in the world of ASD. And then there is the population of young people which we know again, who become very prompt dependent and again very functionally impaired. So we have an eating programme also in the programme that we run, and the kids are incredibly motivated by the food, but they will sit and not have any intentional movement towards that food. They'll be looking very anxiously at the person who's sitting across from them, desiring a verbal prompt or a physical prompt, and they can sit there for a lengthy period of time. Or they won't go out the door. They'll stand at the door and wait for direction, and this permeates all aspects of their life. Very, very worrying for the parents because they think it's a regression, a medical regression of some way, and it takes a long time to help the parents understand that it's not a medical regression, but it's a behavioural response to how they have been directed through their life. And actually with the right input, we can move that forward. But for young people on the spectrum, this seems to be quite a specific area of stuckness for them, and whilst other young people would be able to move forward and have their movements more fluid and more spontaneous, they get stuck in these very repetitive patterns of doing absolutely nothing without cajoling from an adult. We had experience of a young boy who went down a chute and he ended up with a broken arm, and he had a stookie on his arm for 6 weeks. And when the stookie came off, he held his arm for months upon months as though he had the stookie on, and he just didn't have the ability to process the information to work out what to do with this arm. And we've seen that again and again with perhaps young people who've been in wheelchairs for temporary periods of time, and when they come out of the wheelchair, there's nothing medically to prevent them, but they can't intentionally walk the way that they walked before. They maybe have a very odd way of positioning their body, but again, it raises questions about their response to certain circumstances and why they develop and they move on in a different manner from children who don't have autism. I think this is an interesting area, and this area possibly comes on the back of maybe the prompt dependency for myself, because we have sometimes said in clinic he's reacting in quite a catatonic way. He won't move. You throw a ball and there's the response where there's no reflexive movement and the hands don't come up to catch the ball, and you realise you've given someone a very serious facial injury. So this is something that is prevalent also in ASD, not to the extent I'm going to talk about now, but I feel as if there's a fluidity of behaviours. I know this is an old piece of research with Lorna Wing and Amita Shah, but quite interesting in as much that they had a population through a service that they worked through with diagnosis down south, and they had 506 referrals to their team to look at this question of whether any of the young people there presented with catatonia. And if catatonia, of course, to some degree has movement aspects in it, how they won't speak or their movements are disrupted. And they looked closely at this, and their outcome was that they thought that young people who were very passive in presentation or had as well as language impairment were more prone to having this presentation at a later stage in their life. And 17% of that population had some form of catatonic deterioration in their presentation, maybe not a straight catatonic presentation, but I think if you think about it clinically, you'd recognise perhaps some of these young people who you almost feel as if had a breakdown, and maybe it's in a more subtle form, because we often hear of young people who in secondary school have really regressed. They won't move, they won't speak, they won't eat, they won't dress. But it's a response to a very extreme set of stressors, and sometimes it is just simply the movement into secondary school. I don't mean simply, because that is a complex period for any young person, never mind for someone on the spectrum. But they said in their research that it was 17% in the patients that they had looked at, and of course the service that they run is for young people who have complex presentations, but certainly they noted that catatonia is part of what happens for some young people on the spectrum. And of course, if you look back at the prompt dependency and you look back at the gross and fine motor skill difficulties and you look back at the stereotypies, you see that it's a massive part of ASD that I don't think that I have probably put so much attention on, and I'm interested to know much more about it, because obviously we want to make people's lives as good as possible, enhance their quality of life. When Lorna Wing looked at some of the behaviours in catatonia and ASD, it was quite hard to tease out what was a catatonic-like deterioration or what was ASD, because there's a lot of overlap, and these are the areas that they looked into that they felt there was quite an overlap in. Obviously, a lot of them refer to movement. So there's the odd gait, the odd hand postures, there was the rocking, odd body movements, the walking on tiptoes, the facial grimacing, and the echolalia and odd intonation patterns. So quite an overlap in some of the behaviours. And then I started thinking about comorbidities, because obviously ASD in many young people doesn't come in isolation. They have other things that are going on for them, and it might be dyslexia, it might be ADHD, it might be OCD, etc. But these areas kind of jumped out at me because of the influence of movement in OCD, this repetitive behaviour, and the Tourette's, obviously involuntary tics. And also there has been some research recently, I believe, on ADHD and thinking about potential neurotransmitters that have an association with Parkinson's. I can't tell you an awful lot of detail about that, but now comorbidities, neuropsychiatric developmental disorders don't come in isolation. So what are we talking about? Is there something that's feeding into all different areas of a young person's life? And then I started to thinking about the female population that comes to us, and there has been a kind of innovation recently about how we think about young women or females on the autistic spectrum, Asperger's syndrome in particular, and how they present differently to boys who are on the spectrum. Clinically quite difficult to diagnose in some circumstances, but then I thought, well, we're kind of saying that they're different and they're matching a different criteria. Maybe in years to come there'll be a different criteria to start looking at girls on the spectrum, but what are we actually seeing clinically for females who come to our clinic? What do we see? Do we see the same things as we see with boys on the spectrum? And actually, I'm not sure that we do, but I'm posing that question because I don't think I had it in my mind for long enough to look closely at the young women that were coming through our door. But I do feel that there is probably a difference. And the reason that I'm thinking this is because girls who are on the spectrum tend to have interests which really need quite reasonable motor skills. And we have the young girls who have circumscribed interests around putting on makeup. It's actually so perfect, and they'll spend a lot of time doing it, but they need fine motor control to get this makeup and hair absolutely perfectly done. They also can be avid writers, so they're scribbling their diaries and they're writing novels, and they're really into writing away, and it's perfect. Maybe the content of the story is quite unusual, but they like to write and they like to put it down, and often I would say we hear of boys who don't actually like to put pen to paper sometimes, but they seem to really be motivated by this. They like dancing, and dancing requires imitative skills. It requires a motivation to use your body in a motor planning way that is quite complex, especially if they're going to fast beats, etc. And some of them can be incredibly good at that. And drama, again, is about social mimicry, and it's about looking at other people and copying, but it's quite a fast feedback. So you're getting that feedback a minuscule of a finite second, and they're managing to do that, and that's why a lot of young people on the spectrum who are females are probably a bit harder to diagnose, because they have managed to kind of make this quite a skill for themselves. So all these kind of questions are going round in my head, and I don't really have many answers for them. But I hope that over the period of today and tomorrow that we could have a think about what this means in terms of motor, movement, autism spectrum disorders, gender population, other comorbidities, and just provoke enough dialogue for us to all bash our heads together and have a think a bit more clearly about where motor and movement issues fit into in the world of ASD. So my conclusion is, what is the role of movement? Is there a gender difference? Should it be central to our understanding, and what can we do with the knowledge at the end of the day? Thank you very much.